Welcome to Apropos. Well, it's not only making temperatures deadlier, it's also making food more unreliable. A new report from medical and health experts is warning that climate change driven by fossil fuel emissions is raising heat levels to dangerous new heights while also worsening drought and food security. It's also increasing the diseases and pathologies associated with heat exposure. Eliza Herbert has more.
Almost half of the world lived through extreme drought for at least 1 month last year. That's according to the new 2024 Lancet Countdown report that shows how year on year people are having to survive record temperatures.
In particular, we've seen a 167% increase in heat-related deaths since the 90s. It's also limiting our capacity to work outdoors, which has an impact on our economies, on our income, and ultimately our livelihoods on which health depends.
The annual report on health and climate change also found that hotter and drier temperatures increased the spread of diseases such as dengue and malaria. Increased sand and dust storms contributed to a 31% increase in exposure to dangerous particles. 151 million people faced moderate or severe food insecurity, with conditions exacerbating threats to agricultural systems, sometimes devastating them completely. And the globe continued to experience record life-threatening events such as extreme heat waves, fires and floods. But despite this, the authors say global emissions are increasing, not declining. As of March 2024, the 114 largest oil and gas companies were on track to exceed emissions, consistent with 1.5 degrees Celsius of heating by 189% in 2040. And forests were cut down at an alarming rate, reducing the world's natural capacity to capture atmospheric carbon. Each year, the report is released ahead of the annual United Nations Climate Change Conference, where nearly 200 countries gather to further action on climate change.
Well, about a third of all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions is linked to food, mostly via agriculture and land use. To discuss this and the findings of the Lancet report, we're joined now by political scientist Sparsha Saha, lecturer at Harvard University's Department of Government. Thank you so much for being with us on the programme this evening. Your area of expertise, it's really centering on the politics of meat and animal rights. With each passing week, it seems that there's a new study, Sparsha, on, telling us what we should be eating, various different health scares, even for the most, health conscious of us and environmentally aware consumer. It can be difficult to know exactly what we should be doing. What should we be doing?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me join. You're right. I think it can be overwhelming, and there seems to be so much information out there, and sometimes it can even seem contradictory. But the truth is that our food system, as it's currently designed, is quickly surpassing the bounds of what our planet can handle. And this is across a range of planetary boundaries, whether it's emissions that are heating up the planet, our use of land on the planet, biodiversity loss, chemical pollution. So all of these are being worsened by the food system. And a big culprit within that are animal sourced foods. So these are things like our meats and our dairy and our eggs. And many of us love these things. They're important to our culture. They're important to nutrition. They have nutritional value. And so I think the key here is remembering that they're more precious. And I think when you have something that's more precious, you're more thoughtful about how you're using it. The reason why these foods are more precious is simply because they use more resources. So to grow a chicken or to grow a cow, for instance, you have to feed the animal. And feeding the animal, because the animal is alive, the animal breathes, the animal moves, involves a great deal of energy conversion loss. So it's more efficient for the human to eat the soybean themselves rather than to feed the chicken or the cow with the soybean. And so for this reason, we use vast swaths of land on the planet to just grow food for animals. There is an extreme approach, and then there's something in the middle. And I think by increasing awareness that animal-based foods that we love are more precious, I think that's a more straightforward way that a person can think about the issue and see how they can be a part of change.
And Sparsha, how strong is the evidence that plant-rich diet shifts can meaningfully reduce carbon emissions and also protect human health?
It's very strong. There is a scientific consensus that a shift toward more plant-based foods will drastically reduce emissions. And this is, in fact, most significant in countries that have high rates of animal foods consumption. So countries like the US, European countries, Australia, countries that are developed have levels of consuming animal-based foods that are very, very high. And so the emissions portion of food that is comprised by those specific emissions is highest. So reductions, switches in those countries in particular can be very influential.
And earlier this year, there was a UN study. It was facing calls to be retracted because it had allegedly misused research to underestimate the impact of cutting meat eating. So how powerful are the meat industry lobbyists in all of this?
There's a big role, I think, in any industry where you have concentrated interests. There are going to be efforts to change what might be best for the public interest. At the same time, that said, there's also an issue of political willingness. Now, this is all of our interests in putting this issue on the political agenda, and I think that in a functioning democracy, there are going to be different interests at play. But if the public interest is not active and it's not playing a role shaping policy on this, then that is a part of the story as well. So I think there is an aspect of this where we all have to look at ourselves and have to educate ourselves and be aware of the impact and petition our policymakers to take this issue on. I think it can be easy sometimes to point the finger elsewhere, and this is not to say that those interests are significant and they play a role. Certainly, with the UN report that you mentioned, I believe what the issue was is that the underreporting stemmed from the measurement and the reporting of only direct emissions and did not include indirect emissions. So these are the emissions that occur, for example, when you cut down forests and you release a great deal of CO2 into the atmosphere that way. So that was not included. It was included in a different part of the analysis. So it suddenly looked like the livestock sector was not contributing as much as scholars know it is contributing, which is 11 to 20% of all total greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. So while interests play a role, there are other factors. And as citizens, we are able to do, I think, much more than we think.
And food waste is also, you mentioned citizens, food waste is another huge issue, isn't it? More than a third of food produced in the US, for example, it's never eaten. Households are actually the largest producers of waste.
That's correct. In developed countries, when it comes to food loss and waste, it's the food waste part that tends to be higher. And in developing countries, the food loss part, so this is the waste that occurs at the farm gate, tends to be highest. So in developed countries, tackling issues around expiration dates, around how much produce is showing up in grocery stores is certainly part of the solution. If you read the work of the Eat Lancet Commission, there are 3 pillars that we could be pulling right now to address food. These are addressing food loss and waste, shifting our diets and changing farming practices. I think part of food loss and waste is thinking about what is most precious that we are wasting. So certainly within that bucket, the meats we buy, the eggs we buy, those are the most precious things. So in your refrigerator, making sure you're using those items first as quickly as possible is a great strategy for folk at home.
And also individuals can only do so much, but there are issues as well with the products that we're actually buying. Health scares when it comes to food, sometimes it feels like they're increasing. This week here in Europe, we've had concerns about tuna, about the mercury levels in tuna. We had the E. coli situation with the burgers at McDonald's in the US. Is it the case that these kind of health scares are increasing, and what can be done about this?
Yes, and to add to that, bird flu in dairy herds in the U.S. as well, which is particularly scary, hasn't reached the status of a pandemic yet, but I think a lot of people's eyes are on bird flu, on H5N1. Yes, these are going to be exacerbated, certainly as temperatures get warmer, because bacteria can thrive more, right, in warmer temperatures. And there's other vectors as well that explain why these sorts of scares are worse. That said, as far as the increasing rate, what do scholars know? From my understanding, the food system has a number of safety measures in place that have reduced the dangers, but the problem is that no system that humans create is going to be perfect. And so with that in mind, addressing the foundations of what is wrong in the food system is going to be the key for all of us, because at some point something will get through the cracks. So we can have as many regulations as we want. We can make sure we're cleaning hen houses regularly, which is part of that salmonella scare that occurred in France, although we don't quite know what the exact cause was. But ultimately, even if we're perfect, or as perfect as we can be, we're playing roulette. Mutations occur randomly, and because there are so many farm animals, and most of them are kept in industrialized settings, the probability that something will emerge and make its way through the system is high ultimately, and it gets worse as our demand for these foods increases. So because we are not able to have a perfect system, a One Health approach, meaning an approach where we understand that the welfare of animals is tied up to our welfare, tied up to the planet's welfare, is one that thinks about the foundations of the problem and really nips the problem in the bud. So I think hopefully we understand that is a direction that we should be moving. And I see public institutions putting this on the agenda more. So I think it's gaining ground.
Sparsha, thank you so much for that. It's a huge conversation, big topic. We do really appreciate your time on the programme this evening. That's Sparsha Saha, political scientist at Harvard University's Department of Government. Well, that is it from us